If you want to podcast or live stream, you may have run across this little ubiquitous ATEM, the economical video switcher from Blackmagic. Let's talk a little bit about what this little powerhouse can do, the good and of course the bad.
3, 2, 1.
Here we go!
Let's kick this off by introducing the little device that saves people's butts. It's so valuable that we rarely leave home without it. True. Yet its real value is not necessarily in what it is supposed to be good at, which is switching a show. Switching a show with all the graphics and videos and titles is quite complicated, and this little device offers a few tools to help. But in the end, it's still an old school bare bones switch. In other words, it's far from what it could be. That's not necessarily a bad thing all around, but the ATEM has some pretty huge limitations. The ATEM is a video switcher. It takes inputs and picks whichever one you want to show, record, or stream, and it can add some graphics and videos. But let's not overstate this. It can't do this all by itself. In general, hardware switchers are not all that good at doing anything by themselves. We can compare the ATEM to software alternatives, again with their limitations. But software switchers can add graphics and videos and much more, along with transitions and complex macro-style instructions and so forth. The ATEM can do some of this, but not all that much. So it's a video switch, and this is its strength. It's the very best simple video switch that may have ever been invented, at least beginning with the ATEM Mini and now the Extreme series. The prior ones were pretty solid, but had a massive limitation, which is that all of its signals had to match, resolution and frame rate. This was fine when you only had cameras, but if you combine these cameras with computer outputs or other video players or maybe some gaming devices and whatnot, things with different standards, then you might have some pretty insane problems. These newer ATEMs have largely overcome this because Blackmagic has finally decided it's okay to make our lives a tiny bit easier, at least in this one area. Capitalizing on this strength, the ATEM is incredible. We use it at the end of the line in any cannot fail live stream, and we combine all kinds of inputs from whatever source they come from. And if a program fails from another switcher, like a software switcher, we can just hit a button and stay live. In other words, we set this up as a bailout or a backup, and it can keep you alive when all else fails. That's one of the huge benefits of a simple video switch. The ATEM ISOs, these fancier units that have the ISO at the end, I don't know why anyone wouldn't buy one of these, includes a recording engine and the ability to output the tracks in a ready-to-edit multicam style. Ready for DaVinci Resolve. You simply output the tracks and you can start editing, but all of the ISO cameras are there. Incredible. And it's a webcam. This is another massive plus. It lets you use any camera as a pro input for your computer, or it lets you cut and edit a program feed with graphics right into your webcam engine. You can use Zoom as a broadcast platform. It's not the best option. It doesn't maintain the highest pro level quality video, and it's limited by the rest of ATEM's limitations, and we'll get to those. But it sure works, and it's a real game changer, helping to force the world into the 21st century. We also use ATEMs for IMAG and other screen projections where we need camera signals without delay, something only hardware switchers can do, onto projection screens. When we need a very reliable feed separate from our main stream, then we can combine our program feed input with direct camera feeds and computer feeds and PowerPoint feeds and anything else you want and switch that onto a screen through this piece of hardware. In this case, if anything fails, we can keep a spinning logo or some other video feed as a bailout. And this is pretty valuable stuff. It means that a video switcher is not just for shows. It's for anything you need a reliable signal. Now this concludes the ATEM's purest strengths. It's video in, video out, and it's done without delay, and it's rock solid. That's pretty cool. Now let's get into all of the things we hate about the ATEM, or at least wish was a little bit better. Issue number 1. Do you want to change the settings? Guess what? You've got to use software. There's no hardware menu or screen on this device. There's no quick adjustments, just pure, unfiltered software dependency. Hope your laptop battery is charged. Your computer is an essential part of the ATEM experience. It can connect directly via USB, or it can be on the same network as long as the computer can read the ATEM and the ATEM the computer. But the computer still must be there, and it must be working. This is how you manage your media players, build keys, build your overlays, and determine which signals go to the outputs. Managing overlays really needs to be on a computer or at least another hardware panel so that you can decide when your overlays are connected to the background transitions or when they need to switch and to what feeds the program signal or how the overlay's even constructed. Now the ATEM models do have this little patch bay built in at the top. I don't even remember what they call it, but it's kind of hard to use. It provides very little visual feedback and it's really just a start. You can integrate shortcuts into a Stream Deck controller, for instance, or utilize BitFocus Companion. But again, either of these two options requires a computer. We use a control panel, an actual Blackmagic panel, to help give us a set of traditional hardware options and help mitigate the need for a computer. One thing that's still pretty good, though, is that if your production is simple, like just using the video switch or having the same graphics, really only two of those graphics, we'll get to that, then you can save those settings in the ATEM with these settings. But if you're running a more dynamic production system, the computer is still required. There's no live production these days without graphics. Despite even SD cards now being capable of holding a terabyte or more of data, in which case a terabyte can store between 250,000 and 300,000 images or more, the ATEM lets you hold 2. You can store a bit more, like 20, in your library, but you get to store and use 2. No movies, no real clips, nothing. Now don't get me wrong. In many ways, Blackmagic is sticking to tradition. I love tradition. And tying graphics into your production in this tiny little device means that you can't change those graphics easily, without a computer, of course. And that if your graphic system fails or becomes out of date or needs to be updated, it can impact your whole production. That's a lot of dependency when it comes to graphics in just one device, especially when you only have 2 options. And you can't even really change anything without going back to your computer anyway. Now our other hardware switcher, this little data video, and here we can see it, bigger screen now, can store graphics on any of its main inputs. And you can select and choose from amongst, I don't know, like 255 or so images on the fly. You can assign them into the graphics library or any input. Now, of course, there are limitations here as well, but at least you have a bunch of lower thirds ready to go instead of, say it with me, 2. Hardware switchers typically stink at video playback as well. Blackmagic uses this opportunity to sell you their hyperdecks. And I get it. I like that it starts automatically when you switch to that particular input. It has pre-roll, pretty cool. But they're pretty flawed devices too. They're very finicky when it comes to what formats they play, and as playback decks, they're pretty useless. So graphics is not really first world when it comes to the ATEM, and you have to live with that and overcome. As an aside, before I move on, there are some really cool super software workarounds, and macros can be built into the ATEM as well. But natively, you really get next to nothing when you get the ATEM out of the box. ATEM audio is kind of like a wild animal. It's unpredictable and dangerous. No compression, no EQ, no limiting. And unless you're on a higher end model, the options can be pretty limiting. It's more like audio follows video, or oy vey for short. Audio is just as important as video. When it's not there, it's even more important. This is an area where the audio functionality is truly quite overstated by Blackmagic. Yes, the ATEM has a mixer on board which uses the Fairlight engine. But what are the audio inputs? And what good is the Fairlight engine? Your audio can come from your input signals, like a camera audio or a PC audio. This audio comes through the input itself. And you can have a couple of other inputs as well. On these ATEMs, you get these tiny little, can you even see them, 1/8 inch jacks. This makes audio your weakest link. Even if you were to use a real audio console, you're still limited to 1/8-inch audio coming into this unit. Most of these wires and signals as well are unbalanced, although it is possible to have a balanced signal with 1/8-inch plugs. But that's the best you got. No XLR, no 1/4-inch, nothing. Just a tiny little fragile, silly little plug. The mixer is also hard to use. It's software-based, combining audio follow video with mixer audio, along with the possible need for something more complicated like, let's just say, mix minus audio, something every live streamer knows. And you've long surpassed the capabilities of this device. The Fairlight mixer just doesn't help that much. It's software-based, so someone has to actually touch it to make changes. And there are no other features limiting, and there's no auto mix. Blackmagic's basically telling you to use another mixing console. This is something you should probably do anyway, especially if you have a more complicated production than just a single microphone or two. But even when you do, you still just get the 1/8-inch plug. Or you can do a couple of little workarounds, but it's not pro. Now, we do see pro audio being routed through the camera inputs, going from a mixer to a camera and coming into an input, or using embedders where you can plug your XLR wires into a device which puts the audio onto an SDI cable. But your options are limited. On the HDMI model, that's not really an option. Both the Mini and Extreme models do have auxiliary video outputs. Now, this is a huge deal. If you're just outputting to a single source, any output will do. If you want to add another source to view, like a multicam, really important, because you're switching, you want to see your inputs. Otherwise, this is one area where I believe the Mini is disqualified with its just 2 outputs, or even this Extreme HDMI with just 2 outputs. That's compared, of course, to the SDI Extreme with 4, or even more advanced switchers like Constellations with 12 or even more outputs. It's important to understand when it comes to video switching that outputs are just as important, sometimes even more important than the inputs. This lets you send video to additional monitors, recorders, and screens. Not just your program video or your multicam, but any input you want. This is the definition of flexibility. With only 2 outputs, you may be tying them up with your program and your multi-feed, essentially preventing you from doing anything else. Now, I personally view 4 video outputs as a bare minimum. And the great thing is that the more you have, the less you ever even need to split your signals. Now, this isn't talked about all that often, but it can really be a big deal. For instance, if you want to provide a video feed to your client, if you have a screen to show, if you have a corporate event and you're trying to feed into a projector, anything you want to do is based on those outputs. The ATEM Minis and Extremes are either SDI or HDMI. Now, you can buy one or the other. If you have HDMI and SDI, of course, you can buy both. This is ridiculous. Unless you're an HDMI only production, which means that you're actually not a pro production, unless maybe it's a 1 HDMI camera, particularly given the limitations of HDMI. And of course, check out our other video on this topic. You cannot survive on HDMI alone. Now, let's be clear. This is not a technological limitation. Blackmagic has combined HDMI and SDI on devices in the past. It still does this on its other switchers that it sells. Even their old HD television switcher from years ago had 4 HDMI and 4 SDI inputs. They clearly just want to sell you converters. Now, our data video right here allows for 8 SDI and 4 HDMI inputs, along with 6 SDI and 4 HDMI outputs. Now, this is the definition of flexibility. Now, all I can say is, come on, really? All this for an extra $100 for a converter? P.S. If you want a converter that works, just click in the link in the description. This is just an unfortunate decision for Blackmagic, and it's intentional. Macros are hugely important, not just for super complex productions, but even simple productions when you want to take advantage of some of the great features of the ATEM without requiring 2 hands on a computer. A macro is really just tech talk for things you want to happen automatically. You hit a button and stuff happens. You can give it all kinds of instructions, many steps. You can change the settings in the device. You can change the media that's going to the media players. You could change up your super source if you have a device with super source, of course. You can change your auxes. Now, they're hard to program. You can't make a mistake when you're programming one, because once you start doing the programming, the device is listening to the buttons you hit. So you make sure you hit all the buttons exactly as you desire. But make a mistake and you start over. Now, you can utilize the XML programmable files in case you want to get into the code talk, but you shouldn't need to. This is like the streaming engine of the ATEM. It shouldn't be this complicated. It should be stupid simple, but it's not. This is just unnecessarily difficult, and it's truly something that could be vastly improved. Just look at the way vmix handles macros. It's a list they call triggers. Super easy to follow. Test, change. If you want to go back. If you want to tweak a setting, and then test it. Then adapt. You can go back and forth all you want. And then, of course, you can go even crazier. You can get into scripting. But really, you don't have to. Most of the time, you can live in the real non-programmable world. It's so much better that way. Seriously, it's not 110 volts and it's not 12 volts. And they charge you like a lot of money for a replacement plug. It's like 40 something volts. Not nice. Okay, rant over. The ATEM is still an incredible tool. But two things. Using a tool like this at the broadcast level is not turnkey. This is not only still largely old school switching, but modernized solutions still take time to learn and limitations time to overcome. And second, come on, Blackmagic, just a few tweaks, and this thing could be perfect. So that wraps up my talk here from Manhattan Beach Studios on the campus of MBS Media Campus. What do you hate or love about the ATEM? I'm sure this is going to get you going. Let us know in the comments. See you next time. And, yeah, you know what to do.